Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you that the fall of a giant doesn't always begin with a war, but with silence? That the collapse of power often starts not with an explosion, but with a crack in the foundation, slowly spreading, quietly ignored. Today, you're not just going to hear another speech. You're going to witness a revelation. This is not about politics. It's not about sides. It's about truth. A truth too many are afraid to face. We are standing at a historical turning point, and what's happening right now in the heart of the Middle East will send shockwaves across the globe. From the streets of Tel Aviv to the shifting voices of Washington, from boardrooms to battlefields, something massive is unfolding. This is the story of a nation once considered untouchable, now struggling to hold itself together. The cracks are there, the signs are real, and for the first time, the world is beginning to notice, but this isn't just about Israel. This is about power, justice, consequences, and the price a system pays when it forgets its people. So I ask you, don't blink, don't skip, don't scroll, watch to the very end, and I promise you walk away seeing the world with different eyes. The internal political fragmentation in Israel represents one of the most critical indicators of national instability. Over the past several years, the country has experienced repeated elections, unstable coalition governments, and deep divisions between major political factions. These aren't just ideological differences, they are fundamental disagreements about the identity, direction, and structure of the state itself. At the heart of this fragmentation lies the controversial push for judicial reform, which has sparked massive nationwide protests involving hundreds of thousands of citizens. These protests have unified people across class and ideological lines, all rallying against what they perceive as a threat to democracy. The very fabric of Israeli civil society is now fraying as a result of these tensions. Prime ministerial leadership has been marked by legal controversies, personal corruption charges, and erosion of public trust. Many citizens believe the system is being manipulated for personal and political gain. The polarization between right-wing nationalist parties and left-leaning or centrist factions has become so intense that it's paralyzing governance. This dysfunction is evident in the inability to pass budgets, maintain long-term strategies, or handle national crises with a united front. The result is a government that feels temporary, reactive, and disconnected from the long-term needs of its people. Moreover, the divide between secular and religious segments of the population continues to deepen. Religious political parties are demanding a more theocratic influence over law and public life, while secular Israelis fear a loss of personal freedoms and modern democratic values. These internal rifts are not just social, they are structural, and they influence everything from military service requirements to education policies and marriage laws. The tension between Jewish identity and democratic principles is no longer a theoretical debate. It's playing out on the streets, in courtrooms, and in parliament. Arab citizens of Israel, who make up about 20% of the population, are also growing increasingly alienated. Their concerns about inequality, discrimination, and lack of representation have long gone unaddressed, and the recent political chaos has only further marginalized their voices. This systemic fragmentation across ethnic, religious, and political lines is eroding the social cohesion that any state needs to remain strong. As leadership credibility diminishes, public faith in national institutions is collapsing. This loss of unity is not a minor issue. It is a foundational weakness that undermines Israel's ability to function as a coherent and stable nation. International isolation and the gradual loss of Western support are becoming increasingly evident in Israel's current geopolitical reality. For decades, Israel relied heavily on a network of powerful allies, particularly the United States and several European nations, for diplomatic cover, military aid, and economic partnerships. However, this traditional support base is shifting as global sentiment begins to move away from unconditional backing toward growing scrutiny. A new generation of Western political leaders and citizens is questioning Israel's policies, especially concerning its treatment of Palestinians and its repeated military operations in Gaza and the West Bank. The perception that Israel is acting with impunity has led to louder calls for accountability in international forums such as the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. The erosion of support is not merely rhetorical. In key capitals like Washington, London, and Paris, discussions are taking place about conditioning or even reducing aid, restricting arms sales, and supporting international investigations. College campuses, media outlets, and even some lawmakers in Western countries are shifting their tone from one of defense to one of challenge. The once dominant narrative of Israel as a small democracy surrounded by threats is being countered by images of disproportionate force and unresolved occupation. This shift in public opinion places pressure on political leaders to reconsider long-held alliances, especially when domestic populations begin to demand more principled foreign policies. Israel's image in the international community is further damaged by its perceived unwillingness to engage in meaningful peace processes or address long-standing humanitarian concerns. Human rights organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, are increasingly documenting and publicizing alleged violations, further straining diplomatic relations. At a time when soft power and global cooperation are more important than ever, Israel finds itself increasingly portrayed as a state acting outside international norms. The Abraham Accords and normalization with select Arab states offered brief diplomatic relief. But those agreements have not translated into deeper regional integration or global legitimacy. Instead, flare-ups in violence have reignited skepticism and reminded the world that normalization without justice is fragile and unsustainable. As more countries in the global south align against perceived Western double standards, Israel risks being caught on the wrong side of a global realignment. Its alliances, once unbreakable, are now conditional. This shift weakens its negotiating power, its ability to influence global discourse, and its credibility on the world stage, reinforcing the notion that its isolation is not accidental but self-inflicted through policy and posture. Israel's economic vulnerability and the visible signs of capital flight present a serious threat to its long-term stability. Once hailed as a startup nation, Israel built a global reputation on innovation, technological prowess, and a robust investment climate. However, recent developments have begun to undermine investor confidence and expose cracks in its economic foundation. The political instability, judicial overhauls, and growing social unrest have led both domestic and international investors to reconsider the reliability of Israel's economic environment. Tech giants and major venture capital firms have already begun shifting operations, capital, and talent abroad, fearing legal uncertainty and reputational risk. These moves are not just symbolic. They represent a significant outflow of financial resources and expertise. The Israeli shekel, once considered strong and stable, has experienced noticeable volatility, reflecting broader market anxiety. International credit agencies have issued warnings about Israel's economic outlook, citing governance concerns, legal unpredictability, and geopolitical tensions. When confidence in a country's institutions begins to decline, it is not long before its economic performance follows. This is particularly dangerous for Israel because of its heavy reliance on global markets, foreign investment, and international partnerships in its high-tech and defense sectors. The military confrontations and ongoing security expenditures also place a growing burden on the economy. Defense spending continues to consume a large portion of the national budget, diverting funds away from public services such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Meanwhile, the frequent disruptions caused by regional conflicts scare away foreign investors, disrupt trade routes, and damage economic stability. This economic pressure is further compounded by the growing calls for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions by international civil society groups and institutions that oppose Israeli policies in occupied territories. As these movements gain traction, they add yet another layer of risk for companies and countries doing business with Israel. Additionally, internal inequality and socioeconomic disparities are widening, especially between Jewish and Arab citizens and between different ethnic and religious groups. These inequalities are fueling discontent and reducing the domestic market's resilience. The widening gap undermines consumer confidence, diminishes productivity, and leads to greater social fragmentation, all of which have long-term negative impacts on growth and innovation. As these economic challenges converge with political dysfunction and international isolation, they accelerate the weakening of Israel's financial backbone. This growing fragility reveals a deeper truth, that even a seemingly strong economy can falter rapidly when trust, unity, and stability are eroded from within. The rise of resistance fronts across the region presents a growing strategic dilemma for Israel, one that directly challenges its long-standing doctrine of military deterrence. Over the years, groups such as Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and newer factions in Syria and the West Bank have evolved from loosely organized militants into increasingly structured and capable forces. These groups are no longer fighting with outdated weapons and disorganized strategies. They are now leveraging advanced technology, coordinated command systems, and growing regional alliances. Iran's backing of these groups, both ideologically and materially, has turned them into potent non-state actors capable of sustained and sophisticated military operations. Israel, which once relied on swift and overwhelming military responses to neutralize threats, is now facing a reality in which these groups are not only surviving, but adapting and expanding. One of the most significant signs of this shift is the ability of resistance groups to launch large-scale rocket barrages, conduct cyber operations, and utilize drones with increasing precision. These tactics, which were once believed to be the exclusive domain of state militaries, are now being used effectively by non-state actors against Israeli infrastructure, civilian areas, and military targets. Israel's Iron Dome, while impressive, is being stretched thin as the frequency and volume of attacks increase. The psychological toll on the population, coupled with economic disruptions from repeated escalations, contributes to a growing sense of vulnerability and fatigue within the Israeli public. Another critical factor is the growing unity among these resistance factions. Once divided by geography, ideology, or leadership, many of these groups are now aligning their strategies and rhetoric, forming a more cohesive anti-Israel front. They are capitalizing on Israel's internal divisions and international image problems, framing themselves as defenders of justice in the eyes of sympathetic audiences both in the Middle East and globally. This growing legitimacy among global civil society and even some state actors challenges Israel's traditional narrative of self-defense and security. Furthermore, the resistance movements have become adept at using global media and public diplomacy to their advantage. Footage of destruction in Gaza, civilian casualties, and international condemnations are quickly circulated, weakening Israel's global standing and bolstering the narrative of asymmetric resistance against a powerful state in this evolving battlefield, where perception, morale, and legitimacy matter as much as firepower. Israel is increasingly on the defensive. The resilience and adaptability of these groups demonstrate that military superiority alone is no longer sufficient, and Israel's inability to decisively neutralize them over time exposes strategic fatigue and diminishing returns on its conventional approach. Social unrest and an intensifying identity crisis within Israel are deepening internal divisions and threatening the cohesion necessary for national stability. The country, once united by a common narrative of survival and self-determination, is now fragmented along ethnic, religious, ideological, and socioeconomic lines. One of the most visible rifts is between the secular and religious communities. Secular Israelis who favor liberal democratic values increasingly find themselves at odds with ultra-Orthodox groups seeking greater religious control over public life, education, marriage laws, and military exemptions. These tensions have sparked fierce debates in the Knesset and fueled public demonstrations, with both sides accusing the other of threatening the very soul of the nation. Ethnic divisions also play a significant role in this growing unrest. Discrimination and systemic inequality between Ashkenazi Jews of European descent and Mizrahi Jews from Middle Eastern and North African backgrounds had persisted for decades, fueling feelings of marginalization and injustice. These underlying tensions are compounded by the status of Arab citizens of Israel, who make up around 20% of the population. Many of them face daily discrimination in housing, employment, education, and political representation. Their alienation is not just a social issue, it is a structural reality that undermines national unity and fuels resentment across generations. The deepening identity crisis extends beyond ethnic and religious lines to broader questions about what kind of state Israel aspires to be. There's a growing struggle between maintaining a Jewish identity and upholding democratic values, especially as the occupation of Palestinian territories continues with no end in sight. This unresolved contradiction is placing immense strain on the legal, political, and moral fabric of the country. For many young Israelis, especially those from diverse or marginalized backgrounds, the vision of a unified national identity seems increasingly out of reach. Instead, they see a country fragmented by power struggles, tribalism, and competing visions for the future. This internal discord is not isolated to policy debates or ideological discourse. It is visible in the streets, in the media, and in personal interactions. Protests erupt regularly over issues ranging from judicial reform to military conscription to housing and economic inequality. Social media platforms reflect a polarized society where dialogue is often replaced by hostility. The result is a weakening sense of shared purpose and national belonging. When a country no longer agrees on its core values or identity, its foundation begins to shake from within, and that internal erosion becomes a more immediate threat than any external enemy. Israel's repeated strategic failures and ongoing military overreach have gradually exposed the limits of its deterrence-based doctrine. While the Israeli military remains one of the most advanced in the region, boasting cutting-edge technology, elite intelligence services, and a well-funded defense infrastructure, it has struggled to convert tactical victories into long-term strategic success. After the past 2 decades, multiple military campaigns in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria have ended inconclusively or with international backlash, often escalating civilian casualties without delivering sustainable peace or deterrence. Each operation has resulted in significant destruction, but none have eradicated the underlying threats or achieved clear political goals, raising serious questions about the efficacy of Israel's approach. This pattern of over-reliance on military force has led to diminishing returns. With every new round of conflict, resistance factions emerge more resilient, better equipped, and more deeply embedded within local populations. Rather than breaking their will, repeated offensives often strengthen their resolve and expand their support base, especially as images of destruction circulate globally and draw widespread condemnation. The inability to adapt military strategies to asymmetrical warfare has rendered Israel increasingly reactive, locked in cycles of retaliation that only deepen its security dilemmas. These operations, while tactically sophisticated, fail to address the political and humanitarian roots of the conflict, making lasting peace even more elusive. Additionally, the psychological toll on Israeli society is mounting. Constant mobilizations, fear of rocket attacks, and the uncertainty of future escalations have created a climate of fatigue and distrust. Soldiers and reservists, especially from secular sectors, have begun to voice moral objections and psychological exhaustion, while internal divisions over military policies further weaken national cohesion. Proportionate emphasis on military solutions also diverts resources from social development and undermines diplomatic efforts that could potentially offer alternative pathways to stability. Globally, Israel's military actions are increasingly seen not as defensive necessities, but as examples of disproportionate force eroding its moral standing and soft power. Each escalation invites not just condemnation, but also growing support for international legal action and grassroots movements calling for accountability. This eroding global image undermines Israel's strategic alliances and complicates its diplomatic objectives. The failure to balance military strength with political vision has exposed a fundamental flaw in its long-term strategy. As Israel continues to depend on force as its primary tool of policy, it risks isolating itself further, both regionally and internationally, while empowering its adversaries and alienating potential allies in the process. When we connect the dots across every key issue, internal political chaos, growing global isolation, economic fragility, the rise of a unified resistance, deep social unrest, and repeated strategic failures, a single picture emerges with striking clarity. The foundations of Israel's dominance are no longer secure. This is not a prediction rooted in ideology. It is an observation grounded in fact. No nation, however powerful, can sustain itself when it turns its back on unity, justice, and self-reflection. Collapse is not always explosive. It is often quiet, gradual, and internal. What we are witnessing today is not just a moment of crisis, but the beginning of a profound transformation. Whether that transformation leads to redemption or to further ruin depends not on weapons or walls, but on the choices made now in this hour of reckoning. Thank you for staying with me through this important and difficult discussion. It takes courage to seek the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. In a world that often rewards silence, your willingness to listen, think, and question is powerful. Keep asking the hard questions. Keep pushing for justice, for peace, and for understanding. The future isn't written yet, and your voice matters. Good luck on your journey ahead, and may clarity and courage always guide your path.